hello. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the stream.
Howdy.
Hi, Alan. Hi, Marino. Hi, Marc.
How y'all doing today?
How's it
The two of you.
Doing good.
Beautiful day in the swamp.
I love it. I love it.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. Today we're gonna go a little bit to the next level. We're gonna get into some deeper security around some of that namespace as a service, and it's all in service of this idea of achieving multi-tenancy. So I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about some of the patterns that we used to work through to achieve that multi-tenancy. And from a network standpoint, there used to be this concept called segmentation. It still exists. And what you would do is you would create network segments that wouldn't be able to talk to each other, and you would stick your developers in one segment and then allow them to communicate. But it's not an ideal approach because it doesn't allow for flexibility in your communications. Look, we're going to spin up workloads, applications, services, databases, whatever you want to call it, in different networks, in different areas, in different cloud environments. And there needs to be some level of flexibility to access that. But at the same time, when developers are writing or building apps on top of Kubernetes and they need access to a namespace so that they can do their testing, or maybe they could be a part of that push to prod process, they need some isolation because there's going to be some efficiency we need to achieve too, right? Like we've got a cluster or we've got multiple clusters. We want to be able to, take advantage of all available resources and run workloads where we can, but still have some isolation boundaries so that we don't have leakage or we don't have this opportunity for some services to access other services when they shouldn't be. Almost like I don't know, I don't like to use the word this marketing term, but zero trust approach in some ways. But that's the ultimate goal of achieving multi-tenancy, right? Having the right authentication in place, even the right RBAC in place, and then still allowing developers to be self-serving in a lot of ways. Marc, I'm going to turn it over to you if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always the goal, is that self-service, right? Like as cluster operators, we don't want to get involved. Like we don't want to be answering emails. We don't want to be, running kube control commands. Like running clusters is hard enough when, let alone having to respond to users. And so what you really want to do is you want to be in a situation where users have as much control as they can. And that makes sense for multiple reasons, right? It makes sense for your users because they want to be in control of their own destiny, right? Like if I have an application and that application requires certain uptime, my paycheck might be based on that, right? Like my bonus could be based on how our application is running. And so if you're now in my critical path for keeping that application running and something goes sideways, I'm blame storming on you, right? Like that's the way silos work, and all enterprises are siloed. And so it makes sense. It's a win-win on both sides, right? From my perspective as a user, I want to be in a situation where I have as much control as possible. From your perspective as a cluster operator, you don't want to be in the middle, right? You want to just hand it off, get out of the way, and go back to buying hardware or deploying more clusters or doing whatever you want to be doing. What you don't want to be doing is getting into arguments on who's responsible for the application's downtime, right? That's what all of this automation is for. So being able to do that with Kubernetes kind of brings that to the next level because you have the APIs, but now you need a way to get those APIs in front of the user, your users, in a way that's manageable.
Exactly. No, and I appreciate you getting into a little bit more of that depth there. So in our environment, in the last stream, what we ended up doing was we actually redeployed Open Unison so that it supported the namespace as a service capability. So what that means is if a developer or I logged into the portal and I wanted to create a namespace, I could, but I'd still have to go through an approval process where someone would have to come in, approve, and then once that's approved, the namespace gets created. We're going to take that a little bit further today, right, Marc? What are we going to do today?
Yeah, so our cluster has Istio deployed, right? And so you should have a way to be able to say, I want a namespace that needs the sidecars injected. You know, the mechanism for that in Istio is a label on the namespace, right? But that label has to get created. So at what point does that get created? How do you know that the user needs it? As the approver, as the cluster owner, you're approving these new tenants to be created. How do you know uh, that the user wants Istio enabled? So that's the first one we're going to do. Then the next one we're going to do is resource quotas, right? Like once you deploy a tenant, you want to have something that says tenant can't suck up all the resources. So we'll create a simple resource quota and again update the form so that the resource quota gets generated based on user input, not just based on some kind of static object.
You know, you brought up something that I feel like I should just go back in time and talk about. Back in my sysadmin days, we would actually provision a pool of storage for file share access, right? We'd hand out file share access to individual users so that they can store their documents and whatnot, just as a backup. And there's a subtle quota that exists there where they know that they've got maybe 50 gigs of available space to store stuff, similarly to what we get with, let's say, Google Drive or something when we sign up for a new account. Now, what's interesting is how, and this is actually going to lead to a question. So we would go out, give the resource quotas as necessary for storage, and then people would file requests, and then we would expand that storage as necessary. And then there would be situations where we would even oversubscribe, right? So let's just say we had 10 users and we only had a terabyte of storage that was available for all those 10 users, but we would give them maybe 200 gigs each. The reality is, are they all going to fill up 200 gigs at one given moment? Probably not. But there's, room and flexibility that someone can do 200 gigs while someone else just does 50. And that lends its question to what we're doing here with Open Unison and Kubernetes. Do we have that level of control to oversubscribe? And then if we do oversubscribe on that quota, what's a mechanism that exists to help us prevent some sort of fall over or like your environment from falling over?
Yeah, so I don't know if there's an oversubscription mechanism for PVCs for space. But like CPU and memory, absolutely. So like we've got a customer that uses our namespace as a service, and they've extended it to be able to do resource management. So user says, I need so much quota. And then on day 2, tenant says, no, I need even more quota, right? I need to expand it. And so we've updated Open Unison for them, the workflows to say, okay, let's look at how much resources are left inside of the cluster. And then based on that, make a decision of, can we just automatically approve this request? Or does it need to go to a physical human, right? To say, yes, we need to approve this request. So as an example, let's say, just to make the numbers easy, you have a cluster with 100 gig of memory. The way that the oversubscription works in that scenario is we'll say, all right, even though you only have 100 gigs of memory, for the sake of argument, for resource management, we're going to say you actually have 120 gigs of memory, right? There's an oversubscribe factor. So that way, when we do our calculations and the calculation says, all right, if the request brings us to within 30% of our overall capacity, send that to a human to approve. That's where we calculate in the oversubscription. So the quota itself doesn't have a lot of room for oversubscription. You kind of do with like limits and requests. But like where the oversubscription side of it really comes in is when you're calculating how much you want to hand out at a given time. because if Kubernetes itself, it's just a database, right? Like Kubernetes doesn't do any of this for you. It's just a database with an API. It's your CSI that's figuring out how much capacity you really have. So if you tell Kubernetes, hey, there's 120 gig, it's going to believe you, right? Kubernetes is a trusting soul. It's going to say, yeah, okay, cool, that's fine. There's no mechanism in there to figure that out for you.
No, that's really cool you bring that up, because that's exactly it, right? You could kind of lie to developers, so to speak, and say, hey, I'm going to give you 4 vCPUs and 32 gigs of RAM, when realistically the machine you're running on probably doesn't even have near as much available. But the reality is, like, when you actually measure the workloads and services, whatever like apps are running on, let's say a VM, it's not going to be hitting 100% of the resource utilization at all times, right? And so that's like, an effort of right sizing. And, we never used to do that when I was doing sysadmin work. We would never right size. We just give them a VM or a server and they'd be on their way. We're a little bit more, actually, we're a lot more defined and a lot more controlled in that manner now. So there's a question here. Are there metrics to monitor oversubscription? There's always metrics, and there
are metrics to monitor usage and requests, right? So there are 2 ways you can do it. You can either go to the metrics API, which says how hard everything's working, right? Because it's actually querying the CPU and everything else. Or you can go to the API server and say, hey, what's being requested, and calculate it that way. But there's no, like, Kubernetes has no idea what an oversubscription is, right? If you have, again, let's just make the math easy. Let's say your cluster has 10 CPUs available, and your requests in your pods across the entire cluster requests 20 CPUs. Kubernetes is going to allow that, right? Like that. Kubernetes is just a database. Kubernetes doesn't care what your nodes actually have. It's up to you. That's an exercise to the reader. So there's nothing specifically for overdraft, or oversubscription. But that's something that you have to build into your platform, into your clusters.
So
Yeah,
Mark,
if you were,
I have.
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I had just one question. Like, this is a thought. Like, so we bring in an approver when the certain threshold is like reached. So what if the resources are not used? So do we bring an autoscaler in such mechanism?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, it's very dependent, right? Like the usually when it comes to, at least in the enterprise world, you're usually more concerned about running out of capacity than regaining capacity. I've got one customer where it's not a Kubernetes deployment, but I told them, hey, Open Unison, these boxes should maybe have 4 gig of memory, and he got 12 gig of memory boxes, and I'm like, I can't use all this memory. Like I can't even, like, Java doesn't like this much memory. I've got to cap it out at 4 gig. Like, I know, but if we ever decide to do something in the future, it's a lot easier to ask for way too much now than it is to try and get more later. And so, in the enterprise world, at least, there's always this sense of scarcity. Whereas what you want to be able to do is you want to help your customers feel comfortable in saying, you know what? Ask for what you really think you need, because we're going to make it easy for you to get more later if you really need it. As opposed to, let's claw that resources back, because it's very rare. Like, unless you have a time sensitive operation, enterprise usage tends to be fairly static. Like you'll have ebbs and flows, but it's not like, it's not like consumer level services where you're like, oh hell, we got to scale up to 10x during the hours of 4 and 6 p.m. because that's when people are going online to buy widgets. Enterprise apps, it's more, it tends to be more static. It tends to be a lot more consistent. So it's much more an issue of how do you make your users as a cluster operator comfortable with the idea of asking for what they need reasonably, as opposed to sucking up as many resources as they can because they know getting more is going to be impossible.
Understand.
All right. I guess let's get on with the hands-on stuff.
Yeah, let's have some fun. So, Marina, why don't you go ahead and share your screen? Log into Open Unison.
1 second. I'm going to have to do the magical...
Screen swaps.
Yeah.
The StreamYard can't do more than one.
Yeah, it's just the reality. That's fine. All right, let's see. All right, let's share my screen. Okay.
All right. So, a couple of things since our last episode. You'll notice Kelly's back. So we had to make a change to the values.yaml file. Two things we needed to change. One was we needed to stick in an organization. So when we upgraded from the login portal to Namespaces as a service, that little tree up there appeared. So we were able to move badges around and have them in specific places. And Kiali got a little lost there, so I fixed that part. And then also from a access perspective, we were allowing the everyone group to access it from Okta. But once we switched over to Namespace as a service, we now had internal Open Unison groups. So I had to change that to users. So Kiali's back though, and we'll have fun with that later. But go ahead and click on New Kubernetes Namespace.
All right.
So it's easier to see. So you'll notice here, if you tuned into the last one, we've got two new boxes. We have the administrator group and the viewer group. So this is where we were having some issues last time, was being able to choose
which group. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So now we're actually pulling that out of Okta. So we got that fixed. We had to tweak the values.yaml a little bit. But so here's the question. It's an Istio cluster. Not every namespace needs the sidecars.
That's right.
Right? So the question is, how do we collect that information? And then how do we provision it into our cluster? And so open up a new tab.
And I think where you're going with this is like whether or not we enable the sidecar piece, right?
Yep. Okay. And we're going to do that from the form. So if you go to openunison.github.io.
1 second. openunison.github.io.
You can do it in the same browser window. Just do it in a new tab. Oh, that works too. All right. So go to documentation. And then customizing the NAS onboarding workflow. Yep. So there's on the side panel, you'll see custom attributes on the right-hand side. Yep. So Open Unison lets you define custom attributes. Now, the custom attributes serve a couple of different purposes. One, it provides a way for you as the cluster operator to ask your customers for information. Two, it provides a way to give feedback to approvers, right? So if I have opened up a request for a new tenant, for a new namespace, that new namespace might need Istio, right? Or it might need quota information. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that this isn't just about the UI. Remember, these are all API driven. So let's say you want to integrate this with your ticketing system, like ServiceNow, or you want to integrate it with Backstage. You don't have to use our portal. We still give you the APIs to do everything and all of the metadata to drive your own UIs. So here we have an example of creating a Istio-enabled drop-down box. Something that lets us say, do we want it enabled? Do we not want it enabled? But really, think about some of the other use cases here from a business perspective. Multi-tenancy, chargeback, right? Like, who's paying for it? This is an opportunity for you to provide additional metadata that says, charge back this group inside the organization. Go to
So
these,
we can,
right? Like
yeah,
it gives you an opportunity. Go ahead, man.
So what I was going to ask is we could basically like modify this and add our own custom stuff if we wanted to.
Exactly.
Okay.
So as an example, I've got one customer that does charge back. And so they need to track certain pieces of information out of SAP in order to do that chargeback. So we collect the information for them from the new onboarding form. So it's not just the technical side of it; it's the business side of how you manage your clusters. Then once we get that information, we then need to do something with it, right? Mm-hmm. So for Enable Istio, this is pretty straightforward. So you go to the next one, namespace labels and annotations. So I think it's actually just the next section down. Yeah. So this one's pretty easy, where we're not really doing anything crazy with it. We can just inject it directly. And, of course, from a security perspective, you always want to sanitize your input. That's the nice thing about our APIs is you're providing all of the validation information. So if somebody were to call the API separately and say, try to inject something besides enabled or disabled, it would get rejected by OpenUnison. So you've got that data validation layer in there as well. So I sent you a new values.yaml file. Mm-hmm. So what we're going to do is we're going to update that so that we can collect this information.
So should I copy some of the text from that documentation site and then we could go back to the terminal?
You want to do it from terminal or you want to do it from like VS Code? I would do it from VS Code. I wouldn't do it from a terminal.
That's perfectly fine. I'm going to pull up VS Code right now. And I'm just going to no, don't open Xcode. That's not what I wanted. Open with Visual Studio Code. There we go. All right.
Yeah, Xcode. You open it, it takes 15 minutes before you can look at your YAML.
No.
All right. So we are going to look for the OpenUnison section. Okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and open this up so that way. OpenUnison. Excuse me, github.io. Got the hiccups right beforehand. Customizing. Custom attributes. All right. So there's going to be a section called NAS, N-A-A-S. So that's Namespace as a Service. Okay. Yep. And then under NAS, there's going to be a section called Forms. Yep. Right there. New namespace. And then, so this is where we're going to add our additional attributes. So underneath new namespace, you're going to add that
the namespace
section.
Plus labels. Yeah.
No, additional underscore attributes.
Wait, hold on a second. Where?
So at line 134, so if you look at the custom attributes section, where it has the Istio enabled in the doc.
Yeah.
So you're going to add additional underscore attributes section after line 134. It should line up with use default.
Oh, okay. I see it. There's an example right above it. Additional attributes.
And if you want to just copy and paste it right out of the. No, you're in the wrong section. You're looking at the namespace labels and annotations. Go to custom attributes. Go up a section.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking at right now.
No, you're down at the bottom. Go up one section. No, in the documentation.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm in the custom attributes section, right?
No, you're in the namespace labels and annotations where you copied that out of. Look for additional underscore attributes, and you'll see what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and then you want me to do dash name Istio.
Yeah, exactly. That's the part that you want to copy and paste in.
All right. Oop. Let's remove this.
You want to get that entire section, not just Istio underscore enabled.
Okay, gotcha.
There we go. Okay, so a couple of things are going on here. So first thing is the name, right? Mm-hmm. So every workflow, so Open Unison, all its actions are driven by the idea of a workflow. And the workflow has two places to store data. The first is in the user object. So we're originally an identity management product. So the idea is you're creating and updating identities. So there are attributes in the identity. But then the request is just this generic place to store information throughout the workflow. So like if you're used to like web development, every web development has a request that's scoped to that individual request that's being made. Same type of deal. It's just a place to store things across the request, across the workflow. So Istio underscore enabled creates an attribute in both places, the user attribute and in the request. So that way you can access it from both ways. Display name, so that's what's going to show up in the form. The regex, so if it's a text-based request, so we'll do that next, where you say, okay, like I want to make sure that you're only entering a number, right? Or a number followed by an M. That's how you do that, is using a regex. And then, again, minimum characters, maximum characters. That's, again, if you're using text-based. If you're using drop-down like we're going to do here, it needs to be in there, but you don't need to worry about the values. Unique. So if you think about this from an identity perspective, if you're registering a new user, you want that username attribute to be unique. So we'll validate that for you. This isn't an identity. This is a namespace, so no big deal there. So next we get to the type. So we have support for a few different types. The simplest is text, where it's just a text box. You can also do a list, which is what we're going to do here, or a dynamic list. A dynamic list is like the groups, right? It's dynamic, the values. But here we're going to be static. And then our values are what the user sees equal to what the data point is going to be. Make sense?
Yep.
So if you save this, and then let's go ahead and upgrade the chart so we can see it pop up.
So hold on a second. What about the Istio and the labeling piece?
We're going to do that next. I want to go slowly so that you see every little bit.
Okay.
So if you save that, and what you're going to want to do is we don't need to run the whole OU control command again. Mm-hmm. All you need to do is upgrade a chart. So if you do Helm upgrade, this one. I'm going to send it to you in the private chat, Marina.
Cool.
Path to values.yaml. So the nice thing about the Open Unison workflow language is that it's hot updatable. Open Unison is itself an operator. It's looking for these objects when they get updated. So when we run this Helm upgrade, the changes are available immediately. We don't have to do anything. We don't have to do anything special. And we don't have to restart everything. So it makes development a lot quicker.
All right, let's see.
Now this particular chart is part of the NAS deployment. This is the form in the onboarding workflows.
All right.
There we go. So now go back to our screen.
Open Unison.
Yep.
1 second. There you go.
Click on new namespace. And look, enable Istio sidecars.
Interesting.
Right? So now we have a way to ask for the information.
Mm-hmm.
Now go to developer tools. And then hit the refresh button. So now let's say you want to integrate this with like Backstage or some other system.
Mm-hmm.
Click on config. It's about 3/4 of the way down. Keep going, down, down. Yep. And then click on the response. If you, I want to make that bigger, yep. And then there's a response tab. So all the metadata for the information that is driven by, because this form's just React. Like there's nothing crazy about this. So all that information has to come to us from the server side. So here's the API that gives that to you. And this API is all documented on the website. There's a Swagger doc, so you can generate client stubs. At some point, we're going to do like a Backstage integration to make this easy. But what you can see is this is all API driven, so you can use this to drive your own forms however you want to. So if you want to use Open Unison's portal, awesome. If you want to use something else, the APIs are available. So now we need to go ahead and add the thing that that actually does something with the information.
That injects the sidecar, basically.
Exactly. Okay. So this is where we're going to update the namespace label and annotation.
All right, let me represent my VS Code. Okay, and I'll go back into the docs because namespace, additional. Okay, so
at the very bottom, namespace labels and annotations. So you want to find the section called workflows. It's under NAS. I think it's going to be near the bottom of the NAS section.
This one right here?
Nope, keep going. It's going to be workflows, plural.
There we go.
There we go. Okay, so new underscore namespace. And then this is underneath new underscore namespace. That's where you're going to add namespace underscore request underscore wait. Yeah, exactly.
All right, let's move this back a bit.
Now, if you wanted to do annotations, same thing, right? It's just we only need labels for this one.
Mm-hmm.
You'll notice the name of our label is Istio-injection.
Mm-hmm.
The request attribute that it's coming from is Istio_enable. So that was the name of our attribute higher up. I'm pointing up in the air. Higher up that we originally created. So if you go back to where we set this up, yep, the name is Istio_enable. So that's how those two pieces tie together.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we'll see this when we do our quota here next. But the nice thing about this is that you can do, like, it doesn't have to be directly from the input into this. You can generate value based on something inside of a script, inside of our workflow, right? So there are different ways that you can handle that. So go ahead and
Update.
save that. Yep. Going to update that. We're going to update another chart as well. We're going to update the orchestra login portal. So go ahead and do cluster management. That's fine. I'm going to get you the right command to update the orchestra login portal chart. And then the other thing that happens here is that, and we'll see this when we request to create a new namespace. And then go ahead and do the second one I just sent you for orchestra login portal. Is that additional information is important context for the approver, right? Like if I'm asking for a new namespace and you as the cluster owner don't know whether or not I'm asking for Istio, how do you make that decision, right? Mm-hmm. So we also provide that information to the approver. So that way you as the cluster owner can say, oh, yeah, I need to approve this, or, oh, these people don't need Istio, I'm not going to approve this request.
All right. I think should be almost there. There we go.
So go back to Open Unison.
Should I log out and log back in?
Nope. Okay. Go ahead and click on New Namespace. You can close that that thing. Yeah. All right. Go ahead and create a namespace.
Space name, Kubernetes, and Istio sidecar is enabled. Any specific group that we want to do?
Do the ext-admins. I think that's why we created it.
Okay. And then viewer group, anything?
Yeah, do ext-viewers.
Got it. Okay. Internal access groups enabled.
Yeah, leave it enabled. Didn't work. Look at the top.
Attribute.
One, you didn't pick a cluster, but also your namespace name, man. That's not a DNS valid.
All right, let's see if it'll take that.
So see, we're doing the error checking for you. So now go back to the other screen. Yep. Look at your approvals. So you've got an open request. And see under additional request details, you can actually see, scroll up, enable Istio sidecars.
Ah, right there.
So you as the approver have that additional context as well. So go ahead and approve the request.
All right.
So now I think we can see this in the dashboard. Go over to
let's go to the dashboard.
If you go to, yeah. I don't remember if the dashboard shows annotations on or labels on namespaces.
Let's go
So
find the namespaces. Let's go see which is the one we just created.
it was Kubernetes.
Yep, there we go. Istio injection
Injection enabled.
Yep,
So
there it is.
we have now automated the onboarding of an Istio enabled application, right?
That's pretty damn cool.
You didn't write a single line of code. You didn't use kube control once, except to do a Helm update. And that's all audited. So it's all inside the system.
Now, let me ask you, could this work for any sidecar-based service mesh?
Sure. I mean, we don't care that it's a sidecar-based service mesh. We just care that we needed a way to update labels. Right?
That's actually pretty powerful, yeah, because this could be flexibly used for, let's say, ambient mesh even, right? Ambient mesh doesn't inject sidecars, but it's still what it aims to do is anything in a namespace that is tagged for ambient mesh, the rerouting is redone basically with the daemon set that's been deployed at the node level. So, yeah, this is pretty damn cool. Okay.
And you think about other use case. I mean, because the namespace is is kind of a unique object in Kubernetes, right? It's a namespace object, but it's really a cluster level object, right? So it's very common to use annotations and labels on a namespace in order to control access, right? So if you think about, let's say you're using pod security standards, right? Or pod security admission is the name of it, right? The replacement for PSPs. That's controlled via annotations, either annotations or labels. I don't remember off the top of my head. But the point is that you can say, okay, I need to request a namespace and I need this namespace to have privileged access. You can control that through a dropdown where the approver can now say, hey, wait a second, I don't want to allow this. This is bad. And reject it or accept it, right? So that gives you a lot of capabilities.
So you're basically allowing people to edit basically the UI as they need to per whatever. Okay, that's pretty cool, right?
I had a small question. So it's not related to OpenMSing, but why do we want to keep the Istio sidecars enabled in some namespaces and disabled in others? Wouldn't it be useful if the sidecars are able to get metrics as stats from all the namespaces?
If your workloads don't require mesh, you don't want the sidecars.
So there, right? So there's. Go ahead, Marc.
Well, I was going to say, think of maybe you have an ETL workload, right? Where you're just doing batch processing. You might not need sidecars. So here's another area where we've got customers using this. You might have multiple instances of the Istio control plane in a cluster because some applications are at one version, some applications are at another version. They haven't all upgraded yet, right? Because when you're talking about a multi-tenant cluster, you're not just talking about multiple Kubernetes tenants, but you're talking about multiple tenants of whatever that cluster is providing. So in this case, a service mesh, you might have multiple versions of Istio running because some applications are working with an older version, some applications are working with a newer version. So you can also use that mechanism to allow the app owners to control when they perform their upgrade to the latest version of the Istio control plane. And then, other services as well, right? Maybe, changing from unprivileged to privileged, or, maybe you need to change your, be able to update your charge codes. Who are you charging this back to? There are a lot of scenarios where, we rag on ClickOps a lot in this industry. But at the end of the day, like, holy crap, you just created a new tenant with no intervention, like no technical intervention, and it was all audited. That's what you want, right? So that there's a lot of power there in what we're doing. But here's my next question: How do you control resource management? Right, like that's the next big question: is how do you help protect against a noisy neighbor? So what we provide are hooks where you can inject code in the form of a workflow at different points throughout the process of onboarding a namespace. So if you go back to, you've got that tab for customizing the NAS onboarding process. So go to the very top. We've got our Webflow hooks. This is our opportunity to do something, right, at different points. So here we'll piggyback off of this to do a resource quota. But Siam had, from Loft that said, hey, you should extend multi-tenancy with vCluster, right? Well, in Kubernetes and Enterprise Guide 3rd edition, when we do the vCluster chapter, that's exactly what we do. Once we're done creating the namespace, we then have a workflow that deploys the vCluster into the namespace.
Oh, damn. Oh, that's pretty cool.
Right? Like,
yeah.
So it's extremely extensible. And this, I think, is a big difference between Open Unison namespace as a service and other namespaces as a service is we as a industry, as a community, are obsessed with declarative infrastructure, right? Like, it's almost a little unhealthy how obsessed we are with how everything needs to be declarative, right? I mean, that's what we're always going for. But the thing is you can't always do declarative. You sometimes need to have some logic that kind of thinks through it, right? If A, then B, if C, then D. And you can't do that in a declarative way. I think it was Joe Beta who used to say, do your declarative imperative work to generate static YAML. And so you get into these scenarios where you might have a Helm chart or JSON, I think was the thing they were using at the time, that would generate the static YAML, and then that's what would go into your Git, right?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because if you were attempting to do like the CKA, Certified Kubernetes Admin exam, you want to be familiar with generating imperative YAML, right? And it's for the sake of the task, but it's just the same kind of exercise, because you'll probably generate a YAML, realize that you need to patch something else, use that same YAML to patch it, and then now you've developed a new workflow that you can integrate with Git after enough testing. So pro tip if you're trying to prepare for the CKA, which I feel like I need to go back and do. It's been quite a while. Anyways.
I got rants about the CKA and the CKAD. That
there's
my land's in Kubernetes jail. The CNCF might send the secret police after me. So the approach we take is to say, all right, give you a place where you can have your imperative actions, where you can make your decisions, then generate your YAML, right? Or maybe kick something off that doesn't. So like in Kubernetes Enterprise 3rd edition, the final chapter, we use Pulumi to deploy an IDP. But we don't use Pulumi after that. Like once it's deployed, you're done.
It's kind of like the network, right? You stand it up once, and this used to be a thing. Like you'd stand it up once, and then you really wouldn't change it unless you were making device changes or you were trying to grow capacity, and that wouldn't be so often.
Right. But if I'm using Pulumi to stand up my environment, Pulumi is really good at talking to lots of different. Like we can talk to anything, right? But Pulumi's really good at that too, and they've got a lot more infrastructure to do it. So maybe what you want to do is kick off using the Pulumi operator a process, right? You could do that here. Like I talk about vCluster. We don't deploy vCluster directly, right? The vCluster deployment is the vCluster command is just a couple of Helm charts and a trench coat under the covers. It's like the OU control command. So instead, what we do is we kick off a job, and that job runs the Helm command, right? We could just as easily kick off a Pulumi program or a Terraform or whatever, right? So you're not, Open Unison can do a lot of this stuff natively, especially when there's just an API to call. But once you get to something a little more complex, there's places where you can now do that. So what I thought would be cool to do, so we've been at this almost an hour, right? What I thought would be cool is let's create a resource quota with input on the form.
Okay, let's do it.
Let's do it. So take the sample YAML that's in there for the pre-run workflow.
This one right here.
And let's go ahead and drop that into VS Code.
All right, let's open up a new. Okay. And then I'm going to stop sharing. And yes, it definitely does sound amazing. The thing is, like, when you think about deep enterprise solutions, sometimes they don't offer a lot of flexibility, but sometimes you need that level of flexibility, and that's what Open Unison is giving you. I mean, without compromising the integrity of what it's actually supposed to do, there are custom add-ons that folks are trying to add on. Like, look, if you want to get to a level of, hey, let's not use Istio, let's use Cilium instead, right? It shouldn't be much more work to be able to take advantage of that as well.
Well, and also
has been so. Oh no, yes.
No, go ahead, Nakansha.
Oh, I was just saying this. Sudhanshu has been so consistent over like all our Twitter spaces and YouTube streams. I see him everywhere, so he's been following
Nice.
since the start.
And
right.
Often in the technology world, the customization part's really important part to talk about. In the technology world, we often talk about, how technology should work. But at the end of the day, the technology doesn't exist for technology's sake. Technology exists for a purpose, right? Like all the stuff that we talk about, all the stuff that we build and we do, it's not for the sake of itself. I mean, some of it is because it's fun, right? But the stuff that we get paid for, the people, that people spend money on, that's because it's supporting something else. So my first job out of high school, or my first real programming job, technical job, I was working in this relatively small company, about 150 people. And our IT department had about 10 people. And our CIO quit. And while they were looking for a new CIO, the CFO was the acting CIO. And I remember sitting in a meeting with him, and they were looking at replacing their ERP. And the technical lead was like, yep, we are going to get a ERP, and we're not going to customize it at all. It's going to be just commercial off the shelf. So that will make it very easy to upgrade. And the CFO just kind of looked at him like he had 12 heads. It was like, are you insane? We're not changing the way our business works so that you have easy upgrades. That's not the way the world works, right? So We as technologists might say, oh, we want to keep these upgrades simple. It's like the YAML question, right? Imperative versus declarative. We want everything to be declarative so that we can just make a little change and everything propagates out. But that might not work for what the business needs. And sorry, if your technology solution does not support the business, that's not going to fly real well. So the customization and the ability to easily customize, I think, is a really important thing when it comes to how we stand up infrastructure, especially infrastructure that users are going to interact with, right? Like it's different when it's stuff that we just interact with. Like if we're just interacting with a cluster and we want to manage it that way and we're the only people who have to interact with it, no big deal. But once you start getting into multi-tenancy, that becomes a big issue. So let's make one little customization here. So let's scroll down. And so we've got our spec for our quota. And let's make the number of pods configurable just to make our lives easier. So right now it's 10, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can see if you look at a couple of places like target name, you see that thing between $2 signs?
Yep.
Name of the cluster? That's a variable from the request object. Use Git namespace, right? Like that's all supplied by OpenUnison for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a text box that lets you specify how many pods you want with a regex that will make sure it's only a number. And then we're going to inject it into our workflow. So to inject it into the workflow, see where it says pods 10?
Yep.
Get rid of that 10. And let's do $, quota underscore pods. And then another $.
Got it.
Yep. All right. Go ahead and create that object inside the OpenUnison namespace.
What should I call it? Or workflow.yaml?
Workspace or resource quota workflow.
Source quota workflow.yaml. Okay.
Now, a couple of things I want to point out here before we go too far. Think about GitOps, right? We were just talking about declarative.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking directly to the API server. What if we were using GitOps? We wouldn't want this to go into the API server. We would want this to go into Git and then let Git sync it in. So you'll see that there's a right to request attribute, and path.
Yeah.
Use Git will be false here, but let's say it was true. It would, instead of writing it to the API server, it would store it in this request object.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'd call another task later on that would push it into Git and let Argo or Weave or whatever you're using as your GitOps controller sync it in. So think about the power that gives you in your workflows for a second. You can use the same workflow to do imperative work directly against an API server as you can going into Git by throwing a switch. And you can do that. You can develop it because it's a lot easier to develop directly against the API server. You get immediate feedback if something doesn't work. You're not sitting there waiting for things to sync.
Mm-hmm.
So you get it working, and then you turn it into a GitOps workflow, and you get the best of both worlds.
Exactly.
So go ahead and create that YAML, that object inside. Now, the OpenUnison operator does validate your syntax. Mm-hmm. So if you made a mistake or something wasn't correct, you'll get an error when you submit it. So we've created this workflow, but we got to do something with it, right? So we got to do two things. We first need to tell OpenUnison to add that additional attribute. We then need to tell Open Unison, call that workflow after the namespace gets created. Right? So let's go back to our values.
All right.
Now let's go back to that attribute section where we had Istio injection. I think if you just look for Istio_enabled, you'll find it.
Right there.
That's the namespace labels. We don't want that. We want where we define the attributes for the form. Yep. So let's duplicate Istio_enabled. Let's just duplicate that block.
Oops.
That line up properly? I don't think it did.
No.
You back up just the dash name, I think. Yeah. Oh, no. You almost screwed up. Your name is lined up, but everything under name needs to get indented. Yep. There you go. All right. So we're going to give this the name of, what do we call it? Quota
Resource.
_pod. Now, go back to the workflow. So what do we call it?
Quota_pods.
Yep. So let's call it quota_pods, just to make our lives easier.
Why did I do that?
I do that all the time. Control B versus Control V.
Yeah, that's always fun. Okay.
All right.
Okay.
And then display name. So requested maximum number of pods, I guess. All right, our regex. Now my regex is kind of regex for numbers only. I think this will do it. I think that should do it.
Yeah, okay. We're gonna use the caret. It's gonna be fun to type that. Hold on a second. So keep it in quotes, right?
Yeah, you're gonna want to keep it in quotes.
Okay, that's it.
Yep, that should work. We'll find out pretty quick. And then as a failure message, must be a number.
Maybe we should do must be an integer.
Oh, you really want to? It's your business. Whatever you want to do, man.
There we go. All right.
All right. So min cars, let's set it to 1. And then max cars, let's set it to 3. So you can't have more than 999 pods.
Okay.
And then we're going to change the type to text. So, and we can just set values to an empty list. Oh, you got to do the open bracket, close bracket. There you go. Do a space there. Yep. All right. So this is what's going to tell Open Unison, hey, add this new item to our form. But we still need to tell Open Unison, after we create the namespace, go create the resource quota object. Right? So that's where, if we look at our hooks documentation, there's a post namespace create workflow hook.
In the documentation?
Yep.
You want me to pull that up too?
Why don't we just update it inside of the, so where we did the additional not the additional namespace, the labels. It's going to be in that same section.
It was under
And
NAS or
why
something.
are we using regex like in this context? Like,
No,
this
all we're
is-
doing is just passing things through. We're not doing anything really smart like that. We're just saying, hey, we're going to take the input from this form and we're going to validate it and we're going to put it into our request object. But you would, yes, Akansha, want to add some logic that says, hey, I want to make sure that this value is within certain bounds. You could do that in this workflow. It's just we're being very simplistic. Okay, so underneath new namespace, you're going to add something called post namespace create workflow. I'll send it into the, there you go, into the chat.
Oh, okay. Never mind. Not what I was thinking.
Yeah, it's
Post namespace. Hello? Okay.
colon, and then the name of the workflow we just created. So if you
So
look in
quote
the
unquote.
workflow object, I don't remember
Quote
what it was.
unquote.
No, that's the name of the request parameter. Go look at the actual name of the workflow in the other tab. So the name was, scroll up, it's the name of the object. So the name is create-resource-quota.
Got it. Okay. And then go back down here. Like that?
Yep. And go ahead and update both those help charts again.
All right. Oh. Line 159.
Oh, I bet the that slash, the slash in the regex probably needs to be escaped. So it's probably actually I think you can skip the slash and the $sign.
So just do D plus.
Yeah, I think so. If you just do D
Caret.
plus, it'll be fine.
Caret D plus.
Caret D plus
Quotes,
$sign.
okay.
I think you'll be fine. Yeah.
Caret D plus $sign. Okay.
Right. Actually, hold on a second. Oh, you know what? This is an easier way to do it. We're going to do this easier. It's going to be caret 0 through 9 $sign, like that.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. All right.
It's cheating. Do put a plus at the end of the bracket because it's going to be multiple characters.
0 to 9. Okay. Let's give this a shot and see.
And then go ahead and do the other help chart too. The orchestra login portal chart.
Tick tock, tick tock. Come on. Let's update. There we go.
It's a lot of objects. So, okay, go over to Open Unison.
All right.
Oops. No, something's broken. Go back to scale. Just get rid of all the slash auth. Just go to the host name. That's better. Okay. So go ahead and click on new namespace. And we can see we have this additional thing, requested number of pods. So let's go ahead and create a new namespace.
Okay. And
then put in a number of pods.
And then doesn't matter, xadmin.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Actually, I want to do something. I just want to see what it does.
So failed must be a number, right? So we're doing our validation.
Okay, I'm gonna do -1. I just want to see what shows up.
Yeah, because I don't think that's gonna. The minus wouldn't qualify.
Yeah. All right, we'll do 20.
Now let's see if we wrote it correctly. And okay, cool. So I like that. So now go ahead and approve it.
Feels kind of like I'm cheating since I'm the one that's creating the namespace and then also approving it.
You know, it's so hard to demo. Yeah, it's super hard to demo to do it the right way because you end up having like, okay, I'm going to switch screens, I'm going to switch logins, and it doesn't end up looking good. But you can see, okay, this person's requesting 20 pods. You know, if the person was requesting 2,000 pods, you might be like, no, I don't think I'm going to allow that. So it gives you as the cluster owner a chance to make that decision.
All right. So one thing I want to see, and maybe we could do this on the terminal. So okay. So it's created.
It's created. So if we go over to the dashboard, and then your namespace should be there.
Yep, it's there.
So click on that, and then you can see there's a resource quota.
Oh, here we go.
Right?
That's pretty damn cool. I like that.
So you didn't have to design a whole new workflow, right? You just said, okay, we're going to do a resource quota. And, it's anything, right? Resource quotas, network policies, virtual clusters, databases, certificates, right? Think about this for a second. We were talking about GitOps.
Mm-hmm.
GitLab, GitHub, both have APIs.
Yep.
Instead of your tenants going to go create a GitHub repo, as part of one of the workflow hooks, we integrate with GitHub and GitLab. And we do this in the book, in the final chapter. When you create a tenant, we don't just create the namespace objects. We go create the GitHub and GitLab objects for you and hook everything up. Same thing with Argo, right? Where some of that stuff has to happen at the Kubernetes level, some of it has to happen at the Argo level. So it all gets automated. So you can use this not just to deploy what's going on in the cluster, but you can use this to deploy the things that support your cluster. Now think about this from a even higher level. You have a dev environment, you have a prod environment. When you create a tenant, you don't want to just create one environment. You want to create all the environments and hook everything up. So in the last chapter of the book, what we do is we generate a dev environment on a dev cluster, a prod environment on a prod cluster, a GitLab project, forks with different permissions, and Argo objects, and everything is tied together. Oh, and Harbor and Vault, right? Because if you think about it, you're going to want to do secrets management, which means you need to provision a tenant into Vault or whatever your Vault's going to be, right? Those are the hooks where you can do that inside of your APIs, all without having to write loads and loads of custom scripts. And we did that in an hour and a half.
That is awesome.
While talking through it, right?
Well, this actually helps me rethink some of my understandings around like resource management and quota management and whatnot. And this work, like this is, when you think of Open Unison, you originally think of it as an authentication portal, but it's actually doing a lot more than that, right? As you get into the namespace as a service bit. Now, can you explain to me how this ties into what Loft is doing with their vCluster?
Yeah, so
and is there anything else you want me to before I stop here? And you want me to share anything else? Or?
No, that's all good. So, awesome. What Loft does with vCluster is they have built a way to automate the deployment of Kubernetes in Kubernetes. So, when you look at what a vCluster does, is a vCluster deploys a Kubernetes API server. It's two components, and we dive into this in detail in the 3rd edition of the book. It's really two components, an API server and a syncer. So when the API server that gets deployed is, that's what the pods talk to. When the pods want to talk to an API, they talk to their own local API server. But then vCluster takes that information and syncs it into the host. So the pod that runs inside of your vCluster is actually not running in the vCluster, it's running in the host cluster. It just thinks it's running in the vCluster because Vault has rewritten the pod to say, okay, don't go talk to the host cluster, talk to my API server. So all the environment variables, all the DNS that you would expect to go to your host cluster actually goes to the vCluster. The trick is you need something to launch that, right? You need something to deploy that. It'll live inside of a namespace. You just need namespace admin privileges and it'll live there. But you still need to create that thing. So where we then come in is we come in at 2 levels. The first level is to automate the onboarding. So when we create that namespace, there's we ran that post creation hook to create a resource quota. Well, now we can just run a job that runs the vCluster command and creates the vCluster. So now you have your vCluster running as a result of the Open Unison workflow. So that's point 1. Point 2, once the vCluster is launched, you need access to it. Like you as the cluster owner need to get access to it. So if you deploy vCluster with the vCluster command, there's a command called vCluster connect. And what that does is that sets up a port forward to the local API server with a certificate to authenticate to it. Thou shall not use certificate authentication, right? For all the same reasons you don't use it in your host cluster, you don't want to use it in your vCluster. So what Open Unison does is that level of authentication that you have with the host cluster, you now get with the vCluster. You get SSO directly into the vCluster. You get dashboard. You get kube control access. The exact same thing. The only difference is, and actually, can I show it? I think I got it. Let me see if it's up and running. Can I get on my VPN? I think I can. Okay, I'm on. All right, let's see here. I'm going to go ahead and close this out and kill Firefox and restart it. Okay. IDP.cp2, or no, IDP.cp2.tremolo.dev. This works, yes. I'm going to log in with my super secret password that I'm not going to share to everybody. All right, so let me go ahead and share this. Present. And I want to share. Here we go. All right, can y'all see this?
I do.
Okay.
I love. I'm seeing Harbor there, and it's giving me like some nostalgia from my days at VMware with Project Harbor and whatnot.
I'm really having fun with Harbor because it's just so simple.
And sorry, for those that don't know what Harbor is, it's actually a container registry that does things like image scanning and a whole bunch of other stuff too. But if you're looking for like an on-premises alternative or something that you can control on your own, instead of using something like Docker Hub or GC HR or something like that, or some other container registry, Harbor might be it.
Yeah, and that's why we went with it so this is the lab that we build in the last chapter of Kube Enterprise Guide 3rd edition. And so we've got a control plane cluster, then we have a dev cluster, and we have a prod cluster. Now I'm going to go over to my Kubernetes dev dashboard. And I've got this tenant called test 6. Now you'll notice, I'm going to make this bigger. It's kind of hard to see. We've got a bunch of pods in here. We've got OU control, we've got Open Unison, we got the external secrets operator, all running inside of our dev cluster. But this is actually inside of a V cluster. See, I got a stateful set here running V cluster. So I come down here, I have access to test 6 dev. I have access to the Kubernetes dashboard for our V cluster, the same as if it was a top level cluster. And I can see all my stuff running. Same with if I want to get a token to access my V cluster. So now Open Unison's giving you the that same level of access into V cluster, that same level of security into V clusters that you get with your parent cluster. And you're getting all the same stuff with the additional advantage. So here we're running Argo at the control plane level. But let's say in your V cluster, you wanted to run Prometheus, or you wanted to run anything, right? Let's say you wanted to run Kiali, for the sake of argument. You, as the V cluster owner, can set up an SSO trust with the Open Unison in your V cluster without having to get the cluster owners involved. So it's actually building on more security. You know, because a lot of times we in the DevOps world, in the Kubernetes world, we tend to go to shortcuts like port forwarding because we don't want to deal with the onboarding of SSO because we don't control it, right? The people who own SSO aren't the same people who own the clusters. Well, now, same thing. The V cluster owners can integrate SSO into their own Open Unison instance without having to have that secret bit of information that's in the control plane. So you're getting multiple layers of inception here, right? But the idea is that the owner of the cluster is the one who's ultimately responsible. Like I talked about provisioning access in. So these are the repos that get generated. So I'm going to go to groups. I'll go to test 6 dev. So I talk about provisioning YAML. Our clusters, right, are provisioning the namespaces directly into YAML. They're not provisioning in the V cluster, right? My Argo, if I come over here, my Argo CD, this is linked to my V cluster.
That
So
is
I
so
don't know
cool.
if you remember, Marino, a few weeks ago, we did a live stream about STS.
Mm-hmm.
That's what this is. So
Oh, wow.
Argo
Okay.
is talking to the V cluster without a token.
Oh, interesting. So it's almost like it's in its own little confined authenticated domain.
Exactly. So if we go to settings and we go to projects, we've got this test 6 dev project that has a destination, which is a CI/CD proxy that trusts Open Unison. And then that gets created based on, follow the bouncing ball here. So I'm going to go, if Carlos Santana is watching, he's going to love all this YAML. So we generated this bit of YAML. Can I do this raw? Open raw, make it a little easier to see. So we generated this YAML that got checked into the repository that Argo CD then synced to say, okay, this is how you're going to talk to our V cluster using a kube API proxy, using kube control exec plugin with Open Unison as the STS. There's nothing secret in here. This could get leaked from GitHub, and there's nothing you can do with it. Right? New York Times just got breached because of a bad GitHub token. All their repositories became available.
That's
never put
not
anything
fun.
in GitHub. Yeah, never put anything on GitHub you don't want to be on github.com. Because they'll eventually end up there if somebody cares enough about it. Okay. You post this on a billboard if you want. What the heck are you going to do with it?
Nothing. That's the thing.
So, so we go through all this automation in the final chapter of the book, which will hopefully be out sometime this century.
Love it. Okay, awesome. Well, I think we are at time here, but that was a great stream. I mean, last time we stood up Namespaces as a service. This time we were able to mess around with the sidecar injection flag for Istio, and even like realizing that it's not specific to Istio. It could be any other service mesh out there. So we can come back and experiment with maybe Kuma Mesh or something in the future. The other side to that too is the resource quota. You know, it just is very resemblant of a lot of the things that you would do way back in your sysadmin days if you were messing around with Microsoft servers and networking. You were basically doing similar activities, ClickOps to build out quotas and limit the amount of resources developers or even just power users can consume. Same mindset, just different era and different workload environments, Kubernetes. So awesome stream. Thanks so much, Marc, for coming on board today. I think not next week, but the week after, we're going to do a wrap-up Twitter space and talk about all the different live streams and topics we covered with respect to enterprise security. Marc, it's been a pleasure having you on board. Maybe we'll do another stream in the future. Akansha, thank you for being an excellent co-host. We hope everyone has an amazing day today, and I hope you manage to get outside and walk around because it's like sunny as heck where I'm at, and I think it's sunny where you are at too, right? And I'll be heading downtown Toronto to the Kubernetes party hosted by the CNCF Toronto chapter. So if any of you are watching, I hope to see you all there tonight. Take care.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
See ya.
Bye.